Stand by for broadcast.
You're listening to Inside Air, a behind-the-wire view of the Royal Air Force, its people, technology and operations.
Hello, I'm Squadron Leader Peter Lisney, and in this episode we meet a former combat helicopter pilot who now helps others perform and thrive under fire.
When I had my first aircraft crash and I flew into wires when we were flying down a valley in Morocco, and at that point I was 24 years old, so youngish I guess, and your life flashes before your eyes as everyone says, and I started thinking about, this is how I'm going to die, and sort of started daydreaming about this. It's about owning where your focus is, and you can do that every minute of the day. So in some ways you're kind of on the front line all the time now, or you're flying your aircraft all the time because we've got so many things distracting us. And I would love everyone to have that confidence and that ability just to sit with a difficult emotion. And I do think that people in the forces probably get it more than perhaps other people do, because we do go through tough times, so we do learn to sit with difficulty. And maybe it's just about understanding that we're stronger than we think, and we often are quite hard on ourselves when actually we're really quite tough.
We'll also reheat a few stories, just in case you missed them. But first, see if you can identify this noise. Find out if you're right at the end of this episode. Now, would you say that your military training covers mindfulness? Could leadership and reflection be considered meditating? Former combat helicopter pilot and squadron leader, Sarah Furness, has adapted the lessons learned from her time in the RAF to become a best-selling author, and discusses operational tours and translating the lessons she learned under fire into military-grade mindfulness strategies for improved self-leadership. Our correspondent, Flight Lieutenant Casey, found out more.
My name is Sarah Furness. I left the Air Force in November 2021, and I was a squadron leader and a Puma helicopter pilot, and I did 21 years in the RAF.
So tell me a little bit about your experiences and operational tours and different exercises that you found yourself on, Sarah.
Yes, well, as you can imagine, there'll be no surprise to hear that went to lots of places. So I did 4 tours in Iraq and 4 tours in Afghanistan. These are RAF tours, so they're sort of 3-month tours as opposed to 6-month tours. And some of those were sort of working on the ground, and some of them were flying tours, but also did lots of exercises in Kenya, Morocco, Norway, to name a few. I'm sure I'll think of a few more as we go through.
So your role as a military combat helicopter pilot, you must have seen some pretty taxing sights throughout that time. So tell me about that experience.
So people phrase it as combat pilot, and I'm only picking up on that because I know the listeners will probably know the difference. I'm not an Apache pilot. I don't go in and shoot people, as it were, but I do fly soldiers. We're a battle taxi. That's what we did. So it would be kind of disingenuous to say that I was in lots of action, but I was shot at a few times, and I did carry some very interesting soldiers doing some very interesting missions, particularly when I was in Iraq.
Now, you've taken a bit of a turn in your career since you've come out of service. So
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about what you're doing now.
Towards the end of my career, I started to become very interested in kind of how the brain works and how we can work with the mind. And I sort of discovered it as mindfulness, really. And I'd been quite resistant to the idea because I thought it was all about sort of sitting in a field of daisies. But I realized it's actually not that at all. It's about training your mind. And then I realized that actually a lot of the training that we'd done in our flying training and in our military training, all that kind of resilience, there were lots of things that I'd learned that I didn't realize, which were all about how to train our mind. And I realized that I was sort of sitting on a whole load of skills and knowledge that I could use to help other people. So I kind of picked all the best bits, if you like, of the military training, and then everything I now understand about the mind and how it works, and sort of clumped them all together so that I could help other people perform and feel their best.
Let's dig into that because you are a performance expert. So first of all, let's start there. What is a performance expert?
It's helping people to work with their mind to perform tasks better, to have a higher output standard, to do them more quickly and to make better decisions. And also, crucially, it's to be able to do that under pressure. And I understand now from the years in the military, but also from the coaching that I went through, is that you can train your mind to do that. And it's really about where you focus your attention and being able to keep your attention focused in the right place when you're under pressure.
What aspects of the military led you to create your own mindfulness formula?
Yeah, well, I tell a story quite often because it sort of models it really well. And it was when I had my first aircraft crash and I flew into wires when we were flying down a valley in Morocco. And at that point, I was 24 years old, so, youngish, I guess. And, your life flashes before your eyes, as everyone says. And I started thinking about, oh, this is how I'm going to die. And, sort of started daydreaming about this. And then I remember the captain of the aircraft said, fly the aircraft, Sarah. And that was a mantra that we had. We always talked about fly the aircraft first. But in that moment, it was exactly what I needed because my mind was wandering off in places it didn't need to be and wasn't helping me. And I needed to be focusing on flying the aircraft. And it's a really, really simple concept, but it's amazing how often we forget that we can control where our focus is. And actually, if we can focus our attention in the right place, that's really all we need to do to be able to perform under pressure. So I realized that actually all of our flying training had been about being able to prioritize what the most important thing was in each and every moment, and then focus our attention and have that, really quite laser focus on exactly where it needed to be in that moment.
Applying that to the day to day when we're going about just our regular duties and our regular life, as opposed to, a helicopter crash, when the chips are down and you have to do it, then obviously you're going to step up to the plate. But how do you make that happen during the day to day, Sarah?
Yeah, exactly. I think there's a couple of things. First of all, it's recognizing that the world we live in now is not particularly optimized in a way for us being able to focus in one place because we've got so many distractions. Tech is so advanced now. I don't know about you, but I've got several applications open on my laptop right now. So lots of things are competing for our attention. It's about owning where your focus is, and you can do that every minute of the day. So in some ways, you're kind of on the front line all the time now, or, you're flying your aircraft all the time because we've got so many things distracting us. But I think the other thing that I really took away from my flying training and from military training was this kind of train hard, fight easy philosophy that we had. And we understood that if you want to do something in a battle zone when you're under pressure, it's got to be an automatic behavior, which means you train and train and train and train, and you repeat it over and over again so that your brain, when it comes down to it, doesn't have to think about it. It's an automatic behavior. So I think those are the two things. One is understanding that our environment isn't necessarily conducive to it, but we can choose where to focus our attention. And secondly, it's putting the time in to training our brains.
That makes sense when you put it like that. Absolutely. I was reading with great interest some of the lessons that you learned during your time within the RAF. You say intelligent and capable people don't always feel as strong as they look. Have you got an example of what made you think that that was a very important learning point that you took away from your years?
Yeah, definitely. So I went through some hard times of my own. It happens to most of us at some point. Life isn't what you want it to be. And in that moment, I think it's very easy to imagine you're the only one going through any kind of difficulty and that everyone else has got it easy. And it wasn't until I kind of worked through that. And actually, I started working at Shrivenham, the Defence Academy, and I was teaching air safety. And so for 2 years, I was teaching air safety courses. And I kind of brought that baggage, I suppose, with me into that. And I'd woken up to the idea that actually well-being, resilience, mental fitness, these are all things that can catch you out if you're not looking after yourself, because I'd been caught out. So I had my eyes opened about it. And then what I discovered was when I was talking about air safety, with intelligent, capable people, I realized that I wasn't the only one that had stuff going on that was detracting from our ability to perform at our best. And ultimately, it's very easy to think of ourselves as, we try to think that we can do everything and we're kind of superheroes, but actually we're human beings and we need to take care of the basics. And if we don't take care of the basics, it starts to impact on our decision making and how we perform at work. And what I was finding was, as I was teaching these courses, on day one, people would be quite maybe closed off about this, talking about this kind of stuff. But by day 2 or day 3, people were really opening up and saying, actually, I tell you what really gets in the way. It's not the mission, it's worrying about my child and her A levels or whatever it was. And so I realized that we're all going through this. And it's very easy to imagine that people have got it all worked out and they're really strong, and they are, but we've all got our stuff. And I think that was, a really kind of humbling and privileged moment for me to realize that.
I mean, we've had some huge catalysts now, Sarah, haven't we? From COVID through to all of the changes, constant changes we're seeing in government, et cetera, and so forth. Do you think that now we're getting better in defence as a whole, being able to communicate when we're not feeling strong?
Hugely, definitely. I think it's become a national or even an international priority. Everyone is very alive to that now. And I sort of say this with caution. I think that there is a difference in how different people deal with things. For example, I tend to talk about I'm very open. I wear my heart on my sleeve. Maybe that's because I'm a girl. Maybe it's the way I'm brought up. I don't know. But I know I'll talk about things. And I know I can talk about things almost too much. And then they become, you give them more fuel. But I realized a lot of the people that I was working with, and whether it's because they're mostly male or whether or not it's that kind of macho environment, again, I wouldn't say for sure. But actually, these are the people that wouldn't talk. And I think it's been really valuable and important that we're now creating a climate where it's more normal for people to talk about this stuff. And that's the first point when we realize that we're not alone. And I think that's the important thing, is that actually, most of us are going through this in some way, and we can probably help each other through.
I'm going to move on to performance under pressure, not instinctive. Is what you said. Now, yes. Obviously, that kind of goes against the grain to everything that we hope that we will do should we find ourselves in a pressured situation. So tell me about this finding.
So I went through the fast jet training system, typical kind of 12-year-old, watched Top Gun, wanted to be a fighter pilot, wanted to be Maverick, went through the fast jet training system, got all the way through to the Hawk, which is, what the Red Arrows fly. So I actually did, reasonably well. And then I remember I got to my final exam and I just fell apart. For some reason, I couldn't do it anymore. And I choked, basically. And I think, that was sort of proof to me that we have this idea that you're born with this ability, or, some people just got it and other people don't. But actually, I think it's something that we can learn, and we expect it to be instinctive, but it's not, because you don't know what you don't know. This is why I became very interested in how the mind works, because the mind will do what's instinctive and what is automatic under pressure, which means it will do what it did yesterday, which means it will do what you've trained it to do, not what comes naturally. So we can train ourselves to be more resilient under pressure. We can train ourselves to perform certain actions under pressure. And that's why we train so hard. But it took me a while to work that out. And I think people give themselves a really hard time and say, oh, well, I should be good under stress. Why? If you haven't trained yourself to be good under stress, your brain's not going to magically do it the first time you're under stress. So it's about understanding that our brains are trying to help us, but they don't know what they don't know. And we can train our brains to do what is helpful in that moment.
I want to talk about leadership within the Royal Air Force, because you talk a lot about leading people and leading yourself as part of your mindfulness approach. Mm-hmm. So what changes would you see the AP 7001 introduce if they were looking at a less militarized version of leadership? What would you see change there?
Well, funnily enough, it's actually what I'm going to write a book 2 about. I think it's about influence. And I used to think of influence as dropping leaflets or almost being a bit nefarious. But The example I use here is we tend to think of military leadership, I think, as very strong, out the front, kind of showing people what to do. And also there was this phrase that we had, sort of, do as I say, not what I do. And it was said as a joke, but actually there can be a bit of a say-do gap. And we think that we can get away with it. But what I've realized is that the most effective way to lead is to be the person that you want everyone else around you to be. And I think about the influence that my parents had on me, for example. And I don't know about you, but I grew up going, I'll never be like my parents. I'll never do that when I'm their age. And now I'm doing exactly the things that they did and that I swore I would never do, even though I fought it. And I fought it and fought it and fought it. And what that tells me is that the power of example is so powerful. So I think we could learn that less is more with leadership and just simply practice what we preach. We undervalue just how important that is. We could close the gap between say-do. I think we could close the gap between the very top echelons and the people coming in from the bottom. I think the other thing is that we tend to think of culture as top down. I was in the Air Force for 21 years and I saw a massive change in culture in that time. But I don't think it came from the top. I think it came from the people coming in at the bottom, because they set a new standard for behavior and they decide what they're going to tolerate. So I think it's about understanding that culture is not necessarily bottom up, but every individual shapes culture. It's not a top down function.
I suppose when we look at it in that aspect, Sarah, and, please stand me down if this isn't correct, if up and down the chain of command, if people aren't regularly reflecting on leadership and how they can improve, then why would anybody underneath you do so? Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, 100%. We tend to be very outwardly focused as leaders, and it feels like the right thing to do. But now when I coach people on leadership, and, I would caveat all that with, I was a squadron leader. It's not like I was an air commodore. So I'm coming at this from a mindfulness coach with the privilege of having had military experience. But I would say that leadership is 60% self-awareness and self-leadership and getting out of your own way and finding out what your own barriers are. And when you do that, you understand the human condition, which means you understand the people around you. And then that means you can be the best version of yourself. I know it's a bit of a cliche, but it's true. And then you set the conditions for everyone else around you to be the best version of themselves. I think leadership could afford to be a little bit more inward focused, not in a selfish way, but in a self-awareness kind of way.
Now, you hinted at your second book, which will be coming out soon, but I want to talk to you about your first book, Fly Higher, to train your mind to feel as strong as you look. So tell me about this #1 Amazon bestseller.
Thank you. So, yeah, I mean, a huge thank you to everyone who answered my call for help. And I worked with a brilliant publisher who sort of really held me by the hand and helped me with this. I wrote the book really because I was coaching people and I had a sort of set skills and a journey that I would like to take people on, everything that I think people need to know to perform and feel at their best. And, not everybody can do one-to-one coaching or wants to. So this is a way that everybody can access essentially what's in my head and what I think people need to know. And really, the ultimate agenda is for people to have self-belief. We're born with it. We're born with oodles of it. And slowly over life, it kind of gets chipped away from us. When you really drill down, the root cause of most of our barriers is that we don't really believe in ourselves. And that might manifest as being anxious, but it might manifest as being angry or prickly or defensive or resistant to change or whatever. So ultimately, the book is designed to help people build themselves up and work with their minds so that they have faith in themselves. And I think the rest flows from there. And that's what I want everyone to have.
I like the concept of looking at interrogation training, how we handle ourselves under that high pressure situation, through to meditation, which a lot of people, they just think it's sitting on some sort of cushion and omming and ahhing and ringing gongs and stuff like that, which it absolutely isn't, but people can sometimes see it as. But I'm very keen to find out more about mindfulness. Tell me about this, Sarah.
Well, I love drinking wine. My friends, if they're listening to this, will be laughing at this because they'll know how true that is. And my twin sister, who I adore, she got us into wine tasting because she moved to Margaret River in Australia when she was 19. So I discovered the love of wine tasting. And then when I became a mindfulness coach, we were introduced to the raisin meditation or the chocolate meditation. And I thought, wait a minute, you could do that with a glass of wine. which basically means that you're training your mind and doing something that you love. I can't think of a better combination, basically. And it goes back to my point that if we want to be more resilient or feel happier or perform better, it all comes down to the training. We have to train our minds, but that doesn't mean the training has to be boring. It doesn't mean it has to be unpleasant. We can make the training fun. So why not make it fun? So that was kind of the idea.
I want to ask you about the interrogation aspect. So when we look at our Siri training and, we really push ourselves, it can really open some doors and hold a giant mirror up. How have you translated that into mindfulness?
There's so much training we did that by today's standards, we probably would call it mindfulness. We didn't know it then, or we didn't call it that then. But, I remember two really big things. One was making little choices. And I tell a story about, and it's a true story. I'd actually won a completely ridiculous pair of pants, underwear, in this nightclub called Flares in Shrewsbury. And they had purple trim, and they had a man doing a sort of Elvis pose on the back. And they were just utterly, and they were also like 5 sizes too big because they were like Wi-Fi. So they were utterly ridiculous. And I just thought, I'm going to wear these pants for my interrogation. I don't really know what I was expecting to happen, but I had a hunch that it would sort of, I don't know, protect me in some way because these pants would make me feel strong. But it worked. And I remember they just didn't know what to make of it. And they were sort of momentarily speechless. But I also remember that they were sort of suppressing the urge to smile. And in that moment, it was just a great moment. So I learned the power of just, even though it's a silly, superficial choice, if you just make little choices, then you feel powerful. And that is an easy thing to forget, but it's so effective when you do it. The other thing that we learned was to celebrate the small victories. Again, now we call that gratitude, but back then we called it celebrating the small victories, getting a blanket or getting a glass of water or making the interrogators smile when they're not supposed to, all this kind of stuff. And these are basic resilience tactics that we were taught that are actually hugely beneficial and hugely relevant to everyday life.
I was just giggling along there. What a shock they must have got to see your fancy pants. That's amazing. Sarah, you talk a lot about permission and how giving yourself permissions changed your life. Can you expand on that?
It took me a while to work this out, but the biggest thing that gets in our way is ourselves. And it's often because we're not allowing ourselves to feel a certain emotion. And I'm not saying we have to emotionally vomit over everyone and kind of be like, oh my goodness, I just can't deal with it. But I think a lot of the time I was trying to wrestle with feelings or thoughts, or fight them, repress them. And mindfulness is really powerful because it just allows you to sit with them and go, yeah, all right, well, I feel a bit crap. I don't have to dwell on it, but I can just acknowledge it. So it's giving yourself permission to feel emotions and not judge yourself for it. It's giving yourself permission to be who you are. I know I've been described by certain people as feisty or moody or scary even, and I don't like that description, and I am embarrassed if I've ever come across that way, and I don't think it's an excuse for bad behavior. But I also realize I need to give myself permission just to be Sarah and stop fighting it, because the irony is if you're kind of at battle with yourself, you just become more brittle, more defensive, more hostile. So it doesn't work. So it's a really empowering and freeing thing just to give ourselves permission, because then like the pressure's off and you can stop fighting with everything. And I think I just fought with myself for so long. And that's what I want people to realize, is that life becomes a lot easier when we stop fighting with everything.
Well, you're getting incredible reviews for your book, and people are reading it and they're really relating to the messages within. Now, I know that we've spoken a lot about mindfulness, and you said that you were being taught mindfulness during your time in the RAF, but it was just called by a different name. If there's one aspect of mindfulness that you would like to see introduced into the armed forces, something that could be powerful for our troops, what would it be?
Oh, that is such a good question. Chapter 5 of my book is about sitting with difficulty. And I think that's actually a really ninja mindfulness skill. And it might sound like surrendering, it might sound like being submissive. But when I went through some of the toughest times in my life, I realized that I just needed to allow myself to acknowledge what was happening and to tolerate a little bit of difficulty. So the mindfulness phrase is distress tolerance. To give it to you in 2 words, I say that's what I'd want the armed forces, and in fact, it's what I'd want everyone to know about, is distress tolerance. Because I think there's this idea now, there's a narrative out there that we shouldn't be lonely, we shouldn't be stressed, we shouldn't be sad. And we're sort of running away from these emotions, and we assume that we're broken if we're feeling these emotions. But I think it's really important just to go, well, yeah, maybe I've got a reason to be sad right now. So I'm just going to allow myself to be sad. And I've got the confidence that I can tolerate that emotion rather than having to fight it or run away from it. I don't know how well I'm describing this or if this is kind of landing with you, but it's something that took me quite a long time to get my head around. And I would love everyone to have that confidence and that ability just to sit with a difficult emotion. And I do think that people in the forces probably get it more than perhaps other people do, because we do go through tough times. So we do learn to sit with difficulty. And maybe it's just about understanding that we're stronger than we think. And we often are quite hard on ourselves when actually we're really quite tough.
Sarah, did you enjoy your time in the RAF?
Of course. It's a real privilege. I got to obviously fly, which is amazing. Deploying is actually a real privilege because, you feel a real sense of purpose. You feel a sense of community. Actually, I was chatting to some year 6 in school yesterday, which was just absolutely, they're just gorgeous human beings when they're kind of 10, 11 years old. And they were saying, how did you prepare to go to war? And I say, well, I'd write a letter to all the people that I cared about. And the thing that I was most afraid of wasn't dying. I was afraid of dying and the people that I love not knowing that I loved them. And obviously it sounds a little bit of a sickly thing to say, but the gift that we were given by deploying to these places is the gift of perspective, because you realize actually, life is fragile and we're not here forever. And so what is actually really important to me? I think that I have been given some incredibly valuable life lessons, and I really want now to kind of give back and share these life lessons with the rest of the world as much as I possibly can.
And Sarah, for people listening to this, maybe they've just started their journey in the armed forces, not just in the RAF. What piece of advice could you offer to new troops coming in?
My biggest battle and my biggest barrier has always been sort of wanting to fit in, wanting to be liked. So that's my own personal thing. I worry about rejection all the time. Some people this might not apply to, but it applied to me. And if this does ring a bell, then I just want to reassure everybody that we all want to be liked. We all want to fit in. The armed forces is a great tribe, and the draw to be part of the tribe is incredibly strong. But I promise you that they will love you even if you show up as yourself. And there were times that I felt like I had to maybe try and be someone a bit different, and it doesn't really work because, we're not very good at faking it. I understand the draw to be part of something, but they will love you even more if you show up as yourself. And more importantly, if you show up as yourself, you give everyone else around you permission to do the same thing. So you're not just doing yourself a kindness, you're doing the people around you a great kindness too.
Best-selling author, performance expert and RAF veteran Sarah Furness, an absolute pleasure to speak to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Absolute pleasure to talk to you too.
With Reheat for Inside Air, I'm AS1 Victoria Andrews. Personnel from the RAF have been deployed to Shaw Air Force Base in South Carolina to support the coordination of coalition airspace in the Middle East. The group, made up of weapons controllers, air traffic controllers and air and space operations specialists, are deployed as part of a coalition force alongside US, Danish, Belgian and Canadian contingents to the 727th Expeditionary Air Control Squadron known as Kingpin. The deployment sees the coalition provide 24/7 tactical command and control of over 1 million square miles of airspace, including Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan and the Arabian Peninsula. The interim Red Air Aggressor Training Service has delivered its first operational readiness training sortie to the Combat Air Force. An L-159E Honey Badger aircraft, a Czech-built light multi-role combat training aircraft, provided threat replication to a Typhoon from 41 Test and Evaluation Squadron in the training airspace over the North Sea. The opportunity to train against different aircraft flown by experienced pilots using unfamiliar tactics is considered essential operational training for frontline squadrons. A select team from RAF Waddington, hoping to become intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance qualified weapons instructors, have taken part in Exercise Resolute Hunter in Nevada. The course provides in-depth theory and practical training in one of the most testing combat tactics courses in the world. Flight Sergeant Thomas Evans said, "The lessons we learn here will enable us to return to instructional roles, helping prepare our personnel for future conflicts against highly credible and capable adversaries." And finally, His Majesty King Charles has confirmed the first New Year's honours list of his reign. RAF personnel were recognised alongside their Navy and Army colleagues. Visit the RAF website to view the list in full. That's Reheat on Inside Air.
I'm AS1 Simon Ross with this episode's Name That Noise. That was the sound of a Glock 17 pistol. Since 2013, the Glock 17 Gen 4 has been the standard sidearm in use with the RAF regiment. Accurate, light and with a large magazine capacity, the Glock is ideal for close quarter battle. On ops, it's both a backup for the L85A2 rifle and also a last line of defence. It replaced the Browning L9A1, which, after being used by the armed forces for more than 40 years, became increasingly expensive to maintain. The Glock is not only much lighter, even when fully loaded, but its double-stacked magazines can carry 17 rounds, compared to the Browning's 13 rounds. The Glock features 3 independent internal safety mechanisms. This arrangement means that a Glock with a round loaded in its chamber can be drawn and fired, saving crucial seconds in life-threatening situations.
That's all for this episode of Inside Air. Please give us a review and subscribe on your favourite podcast app, and join us again soon.
You've been listening to Inside Air, a behind-the-wire view of the Royal Air Force, its people, technology and operations. If you're serving in the RAF and have a story for us, please speak to your unit media and communications officer. Inside Air is written and produced for the Royal Air Force by RAF Media Reserves.